Hello, everyone. This is the 74th episode of the Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles, and I'm joined by Paul from Shipley in England. For this episode, we welcome back Mr. David Stuart of the Scotland Epistles football magazine, as we discuss the matches of the Scotland national team for the 1985-86 season. Our other regular guest, Mr. Clark Gillies, is unavailable this time, but hopefully we'll be back next time.
Good morning, Davey, and welcome back.
Well, thank you for having me again.
Can you just start off by describing the state of the Scottish national team ahead of this season?
Obviously, at the tail end of the previous season, we had won the game in Iceland. And so it set us up nicely for the final game against Wales, where we only needed a draw to get through to the playoffs. But, I think there was still a lot of thoughts that the previous game against Wales at Hampden, Scotland had failed to turn up. So there was a lot of talk about how, they needed to improve, they need to show themselves at this game in Cardiff. But I think for the Welsh side, there was a lot of, no, you did turn up, we were just so much better. We're kind of put off by the whole thing as well. I used to saying we're not very good, but in reality, we're as good as yous. And we proved ourselves better that night. So I think there was a lot riding on the game in terms of just prestige for both sides as well.
Was there expectation of a victory or just to get through?
I think it was just to get through, but obviously they had all, if you think back to the 78 qualification at Anfield where we beat Wales 2-0 in the controversial Joe Jordan penalty incident, there was obviously an awful lot of build-up about that and about, I suppose, for the Welsh revenge, but for us it was, no, we're going to do this again. I tell you, we always believed we had better players. If you look who was available for Scotland and who was available for Wales, you'd probably see a disparity in some ways. Wales had some great players like Mark Hughes and Ian Rush and things like that. But we had, I think, bigger players as well. Dalglish, Archibald, Hansen. There were quite a few of them never played that night.
Let's go and discuss this match on September 10th, 1985 at Cardiff's Ninian Park. And incidentally, Wales chose to play in Ninian Park instead of their customary Wrexham venue because they were in financial trouble and the extra gate receipts reportedly kept them solvent for 4 years. As far as Scotland, they were missing Graham Souness through suspension for yellow card accumulation, as well as Alan Hansen, Kenny Dalglish, and Mo Johnson through injury. Let's go through the Scotland lineup on this fateful day on September 10th. Jim Leighton of Aberdeen goal. He'd be replaced by Alan Ruff of Hibs in the 46th minute in the second half. Richard Gough of Dundee United, Maurice Malpas of Dundee United, Alex McLeish of Aberdeen, Willie Miller of Aberdeen captaining the side in Souness' absence, Roy Aitken of Celtic, Steve Nicol of Liverpool, Gordon Strachan of Manchester United. He'd be replaced by Davy Cooper of Rangers Glasgow in the 61st minute, Graham Sharp of Everton, Jim Bett of Aberdeen, and David Speedy of Chelsea in what would be Jock Stein's final match. Wales took the lead in the 13th minute when Mark Hughes slotted in Peter Nicholas's cross. Scotland would have to struggle and suffer for most of the match. There's an incident in this match where Jim Leighton is forced to be substituted in the second half. And apparently he had a contact lens that was displaced after a collision with Ian Rush. there was no choice but to replace him with Alan Ruff. Davy Cooper was sent on for Strachan. At first, it seemed like Steve Nicol was going to be substituted instead of Strachan. For 30 seconds, the number 7 sign was held up until reverting to number 8 for Strachan. 10 minutes left in a match. Scotland were awarded a penalty kick after David Phillips handled in a box from a Speedy shot. And Scotland substitute Davy Cooper scored from the ensuing penalty kick to give Scotland the point that they needed. But obviously, the drama was really what happened afterwards. Can you walk us through the sequence of events leading to the unfortunate heart attack of Jock Stein?
I suppose the match itself, you would have to say that for the majority of Wales were on top, and getting the early goal kept them on the front foot. I think it was a poor goal to lose as well. If you look, there's a tackle on Nicholas by Roy Aitken. I'm not sure who the other player is that's involved in it, but they kind of seem to mistime their tackles, and he's through, balls put across, and Hughes slots it away. The half-time thing there was a bit of furore about that because Alec Ferguson, who was the assistant manager, didn't know that Jim Leighton even used contact lenses. So there was a big, I think it was supposed to be a lot of shouting going on and things like that. Alan Ruff was called into the dressing room. Jock Stein's last words were apparently, "You're on, you fat bastard." But I suppose given Alan Ruff, he probably just shrugged his shoulders and went on, but it was quite bizarre to say the least. But in saying that, for what I've seen of the highlights, what I remember of the game, he wasn't really tested or put under much pressure. As I did say that Wales were probably the better side for the majority, but it didn't produce that many attempts at goal. The switch, Cooper for Strachan. Cooper certainly came onto a game and things like that, and we seemed to improve. The penalty, was it ball to hand? Was it hand to ball? It was one of those where Speedy kind of flicks it and the defender's arm's up anyway and it hits his arm. I suppose there might have been a few grumbles about that one. Cooper stepped up, took it. Southall nearly got it, but not quite. And, that was it. All the cheers at full time and things like that. And suddenly you find out that Jock Stein's taking a heart attack, and by I think 9:50 p.m. is pronounced dead. It's just so sad. He was only 62 as well, which is quite young. Nowadays that is very young, but I think it was quite tragic, and I think it just kind of, if you think Anfield, the elation after that, there was a whole different side to it. I think it took, a lot away from the game and a lot away from, the whole World Cup experience. About, even though we were just progressing to the playoffs as such, it was so sad.
And how would you summarise Jock Stein's tenure as national team manager, his successes and perhaps any errors along the way while he was in charge?
I think the big difference between Jock Stein, Celtic manager, and Jock Stein, Scotland manager, was he was a lot more cautious. But I think he did state when he became manager that the game was changing. And you have to change with the times. With that free-flowing attacking football that Celtic had, you couldn't reproduce that on the world stage at that time. I think, sadly, like most Scotland teams, they underperformed in Jock Stein's time as well. You think of the calibre of players that we had, and we did kind of fail at the World Cup in '82. European Championships, we got nowhere near. We did kind of scrape in here as well. His overall stats were played 61, won 26, drew 12, lost 23, for 80, and against 70. So even though he was a bit more cautious, we were still leaking a high amount of goals over the time. I suppose reality is he did get us to 2 World Cups, even although Ferguson would take over the last part of that. I think that's the way it was going anyway.
Can you describe the immediate aftermath that led to the appointment of Alex Ferguson as interim manager?
I think it was quite quickly decided that in terms of the playoffs, it would be best that he was in place. And I think he was keen to do it to continue Jock's legacy in many ways. Was there many other candidates at the time? I don't know. But you probably could have said Billy McNeil, who was at Manchester City, would have been a good candidate. I was looking at something the other day on Twitter, and there's an article, I think it was in the Shoot, where Scotland want Brian Clough. Would have been a whole different setup, I imagine. But no, I don't. There wasn't many cries to say, no, it shouldn't be Ferguson. And it's hard to say whether it was right or wrong, because I think in the end, they got to the World Cup. They performed reasonably well in the World Cup as well. I think they were unlucky in some things. Whether another manager would have brought some other luck, I don't know. So as I say, there was hardly any outcry in Scotland. It was felt this is the right thing to do. You might find that, I do wonder if Aberdeen supporters maybe think Aberdeen won the League Cup and won the Scottish Cup that season, but kind of fell away from the league. Had he been able to concentrate 100%, would they have won it? I don't know, because it was quite close in the end. Scotland beat Wales in goal difference, progressed, and we actually still had to wait a fortnight because we still had to see if Spain would beat Iceland. Either if they'd drawn or if they had lost, we would have automatically qualified. But I think the other thing is, I say, we beat Wales by goal difference, but nowadays the rule would have possibly been head-to-head, so we actually would have lost and not went through.
Alex Ferguson's first match as caretaker manager was on following month, on October 16th, friendly with East Germany at Glasgow at Hampden Park. For this match, we have the following lineup. Jim Leighton in goal. He replaced by international debutant Andy Gorham of Oldham Athletic in the 49th minute. Gorham was the first Oldham Athletic player in 71 years to play for Scotland. So then you have Richard Gough, Arthur Albiston of Manchester United, Willie Miller and Alex McLeish of Aberdeen. Captaining the side, Graham Souness of Sampdoria in Italy, Kenny Dalglish of Liverpool, Steve Nicol, Mo Johnson of Celtic Glasgow. He replaced by David Speedy of Chelsea in the 65th minute. Roy Aitken of Celtic. He replaced by Paul McStay of Celtic in the 81st minute. And Davy Cooper. As far as Mo Johnson, this would be his last appearance of the season, but he would return the following season. The match ended as a scoreless tie, and this was Scotland's last friendly ahead of the World Cup qualifier playoffs against Australia.
Yeah, I suppose one of the things there was quite a few withdrawals for this. Graham Sharp, Andy Gray, Maurice Malpass, Alan Hansen, which wouldn't have done him any favours by the public, because Alan Hansen was always withdrawn, it seemed to most people. And I think in Scotland, there was a particular dislike to him as well, so you can imagine, Hansen out again, surprise, surprise sort of thing. I think Gordon Strachan withdrew as well. Interestingly, among the subs for that night, Frank McAvenny has come on the subs bench. He's having a great season with West Ham. But the other one is Stuart McKimmie of Aberdeen, who actually wouldn't win his first cap until about 3 years later. As to the game, one of the headlines before the match was it would be an all-out assault on East Germany. Next day it was all style and no punch. You know, it's kind of sums it up. I think they played well enough, they created enough, but it was just that lack of finishing, which is a Scottish thing generally, isn't it? I think Willie Miller hit the bar, and that's about it. I think there's a theme throughout this whole season where most of our best chances go to a defender and not a forward. But no, it was seems a bit of a poor game, or a poor result, shall we say, in the end.
Yeah, this one was obviously the start of Andy Gorham's international career, and Sean, I think he said this was the first Scotland player to be first Oldham player to be capped by Scotland since around the First World War. I think it's probably the first cap for any current Oldham player for any country since then. So it was big news for Oldham anyway.
I think Paul Bernard got a Scotland
Bernard
cap
later on. Yeah, that's right.
No, one of the things it was talked about Andy Gorham getting some of the match to make sure that he became Scottish, you know, because the English were looking at him as well. And I think it was, no, get him on the pitch. That's it. Of course, he was greeted with chants of, "You're not English anymore," you know, which is actually quite a common one for Scotland at times, you know.
Yeah, he was already a really good goalkeeper. He was the first goalkeeper I remember seeing at Oldham, and he was, you know, even by the standards at the time, he was maybe a little bit short for goalkeeper at the time, but you know, incredible agility, great shot stopper, and you know, I think everyone at Oldham was really pleased that he was capped. And you're right, I think he'd been in an England under-21 squad the previous year, but wasn't picked. So yeah, Scotland were keen to get him, and turned out took a few years to establish himself, didn't he? But yeah, once he did, yeah. Outstanding goalkeeper.
Indeed.
So this brought us on to the playoff, as you mentioned, with Australia. And what was the feeling ahead of this? Was that this was a good tie to be, a good team to be playing, or was there a little bit of apprehension that this could still go wrong?
No, I think this was one of those ones where it was kind of, we're going to win this. It's no bother. It's Australia. I mean, because Australian football wasn't looked upon as anything decent at that point. I mean, they'd qualified over New Zealand and Israel, who was in their group at that point as well. No, I think it was quite buoyant, quite, this is going to happen. This is us. We're going through it. Was that kind of way?
The first leg of these home and away playoff qualifiers was on November 20th at Glasgow at Hampden Park. So for this match, we have Jim Leighton, Steve Nicol, Maurice Malpas, Alex McLeish, Willie Miller, captain of the team Graham Souness, Kenny Dalglish. He'd be replaced by Graham Sharp in the 69th minute. Gordon Strachan. He'd be replaced by Jim Bett of Aberdeen in the 83rd minute. Making his international debut, Frank McAveney of West Ham United, Roy Aitken, and Davy Cooper. Scotland would win this match 2-0 in a 3-minute spell in the second half. In the 57th minute, Davy Cooper scored from a free kick. Just a few minutes later, international debutant McAveney would score his first goal for Scotland. A long cross from McLeish was headed across by Dalglish in the path of the onrushing McAveney, who chipped over the Australian goalkeeper to give Scotland the win. They seemed to be home and dry at that point. The second leg in Australia was on December 4th. At Melbourne. For this match, there are some withdrawals. Steve Nicol withdrew due to an illness in his family. Kenny Dalglish and Gordon Strachan withdrew to stay back and help their respective clubs. Jim Bett missed this match through injury. as well as Mo Johnson, who actually got ill with flu during the trip. So for this match on December 4th at Melbourne, we have the following lineup: Jim Leighton, Richard Gough, Maurice Malpas, Alex McLeish, Willie Miller, captain of the side Graham Souness, David Speedy. He'd be replaced by Graham Sharp in the 76th minute, Paul McStay, Frank McAvaney, Roy Aitken, and Davy Cooper. The match would end as a scoreless tie, and Scotland were through to this was their fourth, I believe, consecutive World Cup. But I assume that regardless, the celebrations were probably muted due to the death of Jock Stein, or was it celebrated like any other qualification? You remember?
You're probably right in terms of that. It wasn't, well, let's say nothing's been as euphoric as 1978 anyway. And kind of 92 was kind of a low level, and I think they kept it at that. Obviously, it's the closer you get to a tournament, the more excited it becomes. But no, it's certainly something to look forward to. I mean, they even brought out another single, Big Trip to Mexico, which nobody bought. Funny enough, it was written by the same people that wrote the English one that year, which nobody bought, which is why England changed to New Order in 1990. I think, as I say, it was, it's a World Cup. You're still going. So, yeah, there's still plenty of talk about it, still plenty of build-up and things like that. But, yeah, I suppose in some people's minds it was kind of muted in some ways.
Let's come to the new year, 1986, and Scotland's preparatory friendlies ahead of the World Cup. On January 28th, they traveled to Tel Aviv to face Israel. This was Scotland's first international in January in 102 years. Scotland were missing a number of players. Kenny Dalglish, Graham Souness, and Frank McAvaney were unavailable, and Alex McLeish was injured. So we have the following lineup: Jim Leighton, Richard Gough, Maurice Malpas. David Narry of Dundee United was recalled to the national team for the first time since the summer tour of Canada in 1983. And of course, everyone remembers David Narry for scoring that goal against Brazil during the 1982 World Cup. Then you have Willie Miller, Roy Aitken, Jim Bett, Paul McStay, Graham Sharp. He replaced by Dundee United's Paul Stuart in the 68th minute. And this was also Stuart's first recall since the 6-1 win over Yugoslavia in 1984. Then you have Charlie Nicholas of Arsenal and Eamon Bannon of Dundee United. Again, this was a recall for Bannon for the first time since 1983 when he scored in the 2-1 loss against East Germany. For this particular match against Israel, Scotland, wearing the yellow kit, would win this match 1-0 with Paul McStay scoring the winning goal. Then we come to Scotland's next friendly. On March 26th at Glasgow at Hampden Park, they face Romania. For this match, we have the following lineup: Andy Gorham in goal, Richard Gough, Maurice Malpas, David Narry, Willie Miller. He'd be replaced by Alan Hansen of Liverpool. This was his first recall since March 1985. Incidentally, this would be his last match under Alex Ferguson, but more about him later. You have Graham Souness, and captain this time would be Kenny Dalglish, because this was his 100th cap. And he was presented with a solid silver cap trimmed with gold by Franz Beckenbauer, who was observing World Cup opponents. Then you have Gordon Strachan. He'd be replaced by international debutant Pat Nevin of Chelsea in the 72nd minute. You have Graham Sharp. He'd be replaced by Charlie Nicholas in the second half, Roy Aitken, and Eamon Bannon. I just would like to point out one thing. Most sources show that Hansen came on in the 60th minute and Nicholas in the second half. But based on the match highlights that I watched, Hansen actually came on at the start of the second half and Nicholas came on as a substitute later in the second half. But all the official records show the opposite. So that's something I just want to point out, and hopefully a historian listening can point out what is the actual accurate, substitution. As far as the match itself, Gordon Strachan gave Scotland the lead in the 18th minute when he chipped over the Romanian goalkeeper from outside of the box. Richard Gough scored a second in the 27th minute. In the 80th minute, Roy Aitken scored the third goal to give Scotland a comfortable 3-0 win. Scotland's next match would be the high-profile Stanley Rouse Cup match against England on April 23rd at Wembley. Just to give some background, we have mentioned this in our previous Scotland and, in fact, our England podcast before. The Rouse Cup was a tournament created after the dissolution of the home championship due to security and other concerns, but it was decided to keep the annual England-Scotland matches ongoing. So this tournament was created as a result of that. The previous one in 1985 had been the first Stanley Rouse Cup match. For this one in 1986, we have the following lineup for Scotland. Alan Ruff started in goal. This would be his 53rd and final cap for Scotland. His first cap had been in 1976. Then we have Richard Gough, Maurice Malpas, Alex McLeish, Willie Miller. Captaining the team, Graham Souness, Steve Nicol, David Speedy, Charlie Nicholas. He's replaced by Pat Nevin in the 57th minute, Roy Aitken, and Eamon Bannon. We have to mention that Scotland were missing Kenny Dalglish as well as Alan Hansen. Jim Leighton was also missing, which allowed Alan Ruff the opportunity to start in his final match. And quickly going through the England lineup managed by Bobby Robson, we have Peter Shilton of Southampton, Gary Michael Stevens of Everton, Kenny Sansom of Arsenal, David Watson of Norwich, Terry Butcher of Ipswich, Glenn Hoddle of Tottenham, Ray Wilkins captaining the team of AC Milan in Italy. He'd be replaced by Peter Reid of Everton in the second half. Steve Hodge of Aston Villa. He replaced by Gary Andrew Stevens of Tottenham in the 75th minute. Chris Waddle of Tottenham, Mark Haitley of AC Milan in Italy, and Trevor Francis of Sampdoria in Italy. England would take the lead in the 27th minute when Terry Butcher scored with a header. They would double the lead in the 43rd minute when Glenn Hoddle would head in a rebound. Scotland would pull a goal back in the second half. In the 56th minute, they were awarded a penalty kick when Terry Butcher fouled and injured Charlie Nicholas in the box. And Graham Souness would score from the penalty kick. Also, we should mention that in the second half, Scotland made a tactical switch. Roy Aitken was moved to the right side and Richard Gough was pushed into midfield and Nicole was deployed as a right back.
I think it's one of those games that's kind of bypassed. It's Scotland never won it, so it wasn't a great victory to talk about or anything like that. So I think the reaction to it was fairly low key. It was because I think the game itself was seen as low key in many ways compared to what previous matches had been. We never do well against England on a Wednesday night anyway. It was St George's Day as well, so you've obviously got to let them win, No, I think England were the better team. Going in front in that spell in the first half, put them on the front foot and allowed them to control the game. We did come into it later. We did get a penalty, which may or may not have been in the box. But I don't think there wasn't a big outcry after the defeat. It was kind of like, the attitude was kind of, let's just put this one to bed. We'll not worry about it. We'll move on.
Now we come to the final friendly prior to the World Cup. On April 29th, Scotland traveled to Eindhoven in the Netherlands to face the Dutch. So for this match, we have Andy Gorham in goal, Maurice Malpas, Arthur Albiston, David Nary, Alex McLeish, Willie Miller, Paul Sturrock, Jim Bett. Making his international debut, Ollie McCoist of Rangers Glasgow. Another international debutant, Robert Connor of Dundee, and Davy Cooper. And just to point out that neither Connor nor McCoist would go to the World Cup. But Ferguson was experimenting for the last time ahead of selecting his final squad. This match would end as a scoreless tie.
It's actually quite an enjoyable one to watch. Actually, I find it's Connor and McCoist, funny enough, for the players who come out best in it. David Cooper as well. Because there was a question mark over David Cooper because his club form was quite poor at that point. But I think this was seen as a match that revitalised him and kind of made sure he was in the squad for Mexico. McCoist, he's in thereabouts. He spurns quite a few chances. But, maybe it might have made a difference taking somebody young, somebody untried. And then squad of 22, you could probably afford it as well. But it become good eventually.
So taken together, how were these preparatory matches judged by the press? What was the feeling ahead of the World Cup?
Well, obviously the East Germany one, as I said, that was kind of put to bed. The Israel one, it was on TV. It was shown live on TV, and I don't remember actually when I watched it. It's one of those games on that. Really, it was on TV. It was live. It wasn't seen as a great game, that one. The Romania game, obviously, we won 3-0 and everybody was in up after that. And it wasn't just the win, it was the manner of the win. It was the goals were really well made, and Strachan's chip in the first half is a wonderful piece of football. Richard Gough scores a lovely goal, as does Roy Aitken, so that there is a momentum that's been built, because at this point we're going on an unbeaten run, and then you get to the England game. Obviously, we do get beat. Seen as a minor setback. I don't think it was seen as something that we view as affecting the World Cup or affecting, who was going, who wasn't going. A Dutch game, as I say, it's interesting that Ferguson had named two squads. The Wembley 21 and the Eindhoven 19, as they were known as, because there wasn't supposed to be any Anglos involved in the Eindhoven game, but Arthur Albiston was picked to play in the Eindhoven game. I think people thought, it looked pretty good. It was a good run out for the team, but again, it wasn't really going to affect much of the World Cup strategy, because we did have a depleted squad. We did, on the bench even was Ali Dawson of Rangers, John Robertson and Gary Mackay of Hearts. Hearts had Obviously, this would be a heartbreak season for them, where they would lose the league and lose the Scottish Cup within a week of each other. They had a great run in the league. You'd seen, I've already said Robertson and Mackay were there, but Craig Levine had come in for one of the games. I think the Israel pool, he was in for that as well. But his debut was about 4 years away as well. I don't know, it's interesting in terms of, you know, the Aberdeen manager picking so many Dundee United players who were actually a good side. That I mean, they came close to winning the league that year as well. I mean, it was Celtic that won it eventually on that last day. No, I think there was enough optimism about it, do you know, and there certainly wasn't any outcries or Ferguson shouldn't be there or doesn't know what he's doing. You know, I think there was enough confidence in him as a manager that I think people felt he knew what he was doing in some ways.
Let's go through Scotland's final World Cup squad, final 22 as selected by Alex Ferguson. At number 1, you have Jim Leighton. Number 2, Richard Gough. Number 3, Maurice Malpas. Number 4, Graham Souness. Number 5, Alex McLeish. Number 6, Willie Miller. Number 7, Gordon Strachan. Number 8, Roy Aitken. Number 9, Eamon Bannon. Number 10, Jean Bett. Number 11, Paul McStay. Number 12, Andy Gorham. Number 13, Steve Nicol. Number 14, David Narry. Number 15, Arthur Albiston. Number 16, Frank McAveney. Number 17, Steve Archibald of Barcelona in Spain. Number 18, Graham Sharp. Number 19, Charlie Nicholas. Number 20, Paul Sturrock. Number 21, Davy Cooper. And number 22, Alan Ruff. Let's discuss this final 22. Much has been made of Alex Ferguson's decision to omit Alan Hansen, and some have suggested that Kenny Dalglish withdrew as a result, saying he wasn't really injured. What are your thoughts on this controversy?
I think one of the things is, do you know, Alan Hansen hasn't really featured in the Scotland team fully for 2-3 years. He's come on as a substitute in a couple of games, but ever since the Swiss game in the European Championship, he's not really been featured. As to Kenny Dalglish, I think if you look at him on the night of his 100th cap, he's running about, he's involved in everything, he's all over he played as though he was a lot younger than he actually was at the time. I believe he had a knee injury. Kenny Dalglish always seems to be is a person who always speaks his mind. I think that's one of the things we've learned about him. I think if Kenny Dalglish felt he could have went, he would have went. I think if he felt, I think the Alan Hansen thing, you know, is wrong. I think if he felt he wasn't fit enough, he would have said, and that's what I think he said, he's got a knee injury, it's not going to be ready, so I shouldn't be going. I don't think, we're talking about a man who played 102 times for his country. He would have been the first British player to play in 4 World Cups. I'm sure he would have taken it. It's too big a price to drop out of just because Alan Hansen's not going.
The other absentees included David Speedy and Mo Johnson.
David Speedy, I think, was quite angry when the squad was announced, because Ferguson had told him a few months before, you're going to get on. But I think Ferguson had kind of changed his mind. It's interesting. I mean, it's whether there's some talk that Speedy's football was probably not suited for the heat of Mexico, because he was a player that just ran at teams, whether his temperament suited it as well. There was that sort of talk. Mo Johnson one is, you start to see things where he is excluded, and it's because of loss of form and things like that, is a kind of put down to. Years after, they did say that it was misbehaviour on the Australia trip, I think, that caused this. But at the time, it's not something that's in the press. It's not mentioned. But I think he knew the writing was on the wall. You know, he'd kind of feared not being in the squad because he hadn't been in the few squads before. So I think that was, looking back, you're kind of surprised because of who Mo Johnson becomes and who he was before in terms of the Spain game and qualifying and things like that. But I think at the time, people maybe thought it was right. I think with hindsight, we could all say, yeah, his strikers weren't good choices, because none of the strikers would ever be seen as prodigious in terms of goal scoring. If you look at Sharp, I think it's 1 goal in 20. Charlie Nicholas, I think he'd got about 5 goals and I think it's 26 caps or something like that. Can't remember off the top of my head. McAvenny would be 1 in 5. Archibald, again, is another one who's about 5 in 30 or something like that. I think that's probably the squad. It's probably what it should be. Arden Dalglish is a big miss, I think. And I'm not sure whether the heat would have suited him either, but quality is quality.
We should mention that Archibald was only called up after Dalglish opted out due to injury. Other things to point out is we forgot to mention that Kenny Dalglish, this was his first season as player manager of Liverpool. And he led Liverpool to the double that season as player manager. Also, I believe in April that year, Graham Souness was set to become Rangers Glasgow's player manager for the following season. That was also in the news a lot at this point in time. The squad was together for 3 weeks. This was Scotland's longest ever preparation. They stayed 2 weeks in Santa Fe and a few days in Los Angeles ahead of their trip to Mexico. So we come to the World Cup. Scotland were in Group E with Denmark, West Germany, and Uruguay. This group was dubbed the Group of Death at that time. Scotland began their World Cup on June 4th at Neza against Denmark, a rising force in European football. So for this match, we have Jim Leighton in goal, Richard Gough, Maurice Malpas, Alex McLeish, Willie Miller, captain of the side, Graham Souness, Gordon Strachan. He'd be replaced by Eamon Bannon in the 74th minute, Roy Aitken, Steve Nicol, Charlie Nicholas, Paul Sturrock, and he replaced by Frank McAvenny in the 61st minute. Denmark would win this match 1-0 with Preben Elkjær scoring in the 57th minute. A few days later, on June 8th, they faced West Germany at Querétaro. So for this match, we have Jim Leighton, Richard Gough, Maurice Malpas, Willie Miller, Steve Nicol. He'd be replaced by Frank McAvenny in the 61st minute, David Nary, captain of the side, Graham Souness. This would be his final cap for Scotland, his 54th and final cap. His first cap had been in 1975. We have Gordon Strachan, Roy Aitken, Eamon Bannon. He'd be replaced by Davy Cooper in the 74th minute. And this was also Bannon's final cap, his 11th and final cap. His first cap had been 1980. And finally, Steve Archibald. And again, this was also his final cap for Scotland, his 27th and final cap for Scotland. His first cap had been in 1980. As far as Frank McAvenny, he would not be capped until 1988 in a friendly against Saudi Arabia. So for this match, Scotland would take the lead in the 18th minute. Roy Aitken sent a through ball on the right side, and Gordon Strachan scored a nice shot from a narrow angle. And of course, we all remember the way he celebrated by placing his foot on the advertising boarding. Germany would bounce back, and within 5 minutes, Rudi Völler had tied the match. Klaus Allofs would score West Germany's winner in the 49th minute, when in a struggle, David Nary diverted the ball in the path of Allofs, who shot past Leighton. That's 2 matches, 2 losses.
I think from the 2 matches overall, I think there's some thoughts that we were just unlucky in some ways. We played decent enough. It's obviously, I mean, if you think of it, with Denmark, you know, we're very highly ranked at that point. You know, you look at demolition they do Uruguay in the next game. But I think at times in that game we were on top as well. Unlucky in how the goals kind of conceded, you know, it hits off Miller's leg, I think, and moves into the path of Elkjær as well. We did have an offside goal, which is one of those ones that's probably at the time nobody said, no, there's nothing wrong with that, you know, but people have obviously looked at it on YouTube for years and years and years and suddenly said, no, wait a minute, it's clearly onside. But at the time, I don't remember that big a clamour, so I'm not going to say much about that. We did finish the game with only 10 men. Charlie Nicholas had a terrible tackle on him with 7 minutes to go, and he was carried off, which meant he wouldn't be in the West Germany game. But I think overall, we played well, and that's one of the things, but you're beat, you know, that's the problem. West Germany game, again, I think unlucky. It's one of those things in all these 3 games, there's chances that drop to Richard Gough, there's chances that drop to Steve Nicol in the last game, but he's a couple of shots in the game before, but there's headers for Gough and things like that. There's a lot that fall to defenders rather than forwards, and I think that's our problem, is that none of our forwards had a great World Cup. Whether it was Archibald, whether it was Sharp, whether it was Nicholas, whether it was McAvenny, but nothing came off for them. The West Germany game, again, you know, as you say, it kind of nearly intercepts the ball and then it goes to Allofs, you know, it's just a lot of that, as I say, I think they were unlucky in the first 2 games, I would say.
Now we come to the final match in a group. On June 13th at Neza, they faced Uruguay, who had just come off a 1-6 loss against Denmark. Graham Souness was dropped from his final match by Alex Ferguson. So we have the following squad: Jim Leighton, Richard Gough, Willie Miller, the captain of the side, David Nary, Arthur Albiston, playing his final match for Scotland, his 14th and final cap. His first cap had been in 1982. Steve Nicol, he replaced by Charlie Nicholas in the 70th minute. Gordon Strachan, Roy Aitken, Paul McStay, Graham Sharp, Paul Sturrock, and he'd replaced by Davy Cooper in the 70th minute. This match is remembered for the fastest World Cup sending off in history, when Uruguay's José Batista was sent off after 53 seconds. As a result of the sending off, the Uruguay manager Omar Borras would call the referee a murderer. Uruguay was fined 25,000 Swiss francs, and Borras was banned from taking his place on the bench for 1 match. The match ended as a scoreless tie. Scotland were out despite numerical advantage. Alex Ferguson resigned 15 minutes after the match had finished. So the World Cup was over.
It's so unexpected, suddenly, the whole 10 men thing. I don't know if that just unnerved the players. I don't know, because they played as poorly as they played at the tournament in that whole game. It's hard to explain it. The thing you talk about Souness being dropped, there's kind of arguments about that one as well, because Souness says he's fit and Alex Ferguson claims no, Souness wasn't fit. He was nowhere near fit. But he was the kind of player you maybe would have wanted in that game. But throughout the match, we were always chasing the game in some way because you needed the win. And I think that's the thing. It just didn't work out. Steve Nicol has a great chance, but fails to connect with it right. And I think that, of course, it would have made a difference. But hey, it wasn't to be. The Scotland and Uruguay games have never been that well played at times. You know, I think in 1962, 63 or something, Hampden was a big punch up. Early 90s or late 80s, there's another one, or mid 80s, there's a sending off and a throwaway again.
Right, 1983, right? I believe there was a friendly, yeah.
Yeah. So it's never been an easy game. They did beat us 7-0 in the World Cup before, but we've no mention that. I think Ferguson resigning, I think that was fine. I think that was expected. He'd always said that he didn't want the job full time at 44. He was too young for it. Yeah, it's a disappointing match, and it's one of those ones you look back and you think, God, you know, just a wee bit different, because even Uruguay had drawn with West Germany, drew with us, and still managed to get through to the next round. That's the thing, you know, even the 2 points would have taken us through to the next round, just because of the way the World Cup was put together that year.
Yeah, it was a definite sending off as well. I don't think there's any question about that when you see the challenge.
No, and I think it's that thing where the player was told Strachan's going to be, everything's going to go through Strachan, whether he's hit that, well, I'm going to hit Strachan, nothing's going through him, you know, except me. But I don't know, it's just almost as though the players were numbed by it. It would seem, or overwhelmed by the occasion.
The end of this World Cup also marked the end of several international careers, as Sean's mentioned a few of those players, Albiston, Archibald and Souness. What can you say about their respective Scotland careers? How would you sum them up?
Well, Albiston, I think, you know, he was a decent right back. And that's what he was, you know, and never outstanding in any games, but I don't think he ever let him down either. Archibald, I think we expected more and hoped for more. I mean, this is a player that did well at Tottenham. This is a player who played in the European Cup final that year. But again, it's a player that just Scotland and his style never seemed to gel. Souness, you know, some people have Souness as their favourite Scotland player ever. Me, not so much. I suppose he does bring that, you know, the reason he's suspended for the Wales game is because he went through one of the Icelandic players. It's that hard side of him. People love that, but I've never been a great fan of that type of player, to be honest. But he gave his all for Scotland, as far as you could tell, is in looking at games and things like that. But can I remember too many games where I thought, tonight Souness was world class. Souness was the big difference. When games where he maybe should have shown up, can I remember him kicking the ball? I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's maybe an argument for both Archibald and Souness when you look overall at their careers, as you say, that maybe they underperformed a little bit for Scotland for whatever reason. I think that's maybe the case with some of the players, particularly that have had good careers in England, but when it came to the national team, they don't seem to have performed quite as you'd expect.
That's the thing. It's just, how do you blend all these players? And I think I don't think Jock Stein ever got it fully right. I don't think Ferguson maybe got no right in that for years and years. I mean, currently we've got a team who probably gel well and blend well. But, you know, we've not always had that when at times we've had some of the best players we've ever had in Scotland squads. And yet the sum of our total achievements is getting to the first round of the World Cup.
How do you assess Alex Ferguson's short interim spell?
He's played 10, won 3, drew 4, lost 3, fought 8 and against 5. And again, it's if you look at that 8, it's 3 goals against Romania, 2 against Australia. So you're thinking in 8 games we only scored 2 goals. And it's not so much about the manager. It's just about not getting goals, I think, at that point. Because the defensive record's pretty decent. It's 3 goals at the World Cup, but in the other 8 games, it's 1 goal. England were the first team to score against us, if you think about it in his tenure. Could he have done better? Probably. But he probably thinks that as well. He's probably thought, you know, I could have done this, I could have done that. Would Mo Johnson made a difference? He may have done. He scored, I think he had about 22 goals overall that season for Celtic. So it's not as though he was fully off form, but I think it does come down to that Scottish luck. In the land of heather, we ran out of luck.
In closing, at the end of this season, what was the view regarding the general state of Scottish football, the national team, and the prospects for the future?
I think, again, you probably think there's big changes happening. Souness is going, Gillies is coming to the end, and the new manager thing as well comes in at this point, obviously. It would go to Andy Roxburgh, and probably at that point, most of us saying, well, we know who he is, but really, we're kind of underwhelmed by it, shall we say. But picking ourselves up after the World Cup, I'm kind of used to that at this point.
So with that, once again, we would like to thank Mr. Stuart for his participation in this series. For any questions and comments, you may contact us. You may contact me on Twitter at SP1873 and on Facebook, and on my blog is Soccernostalgia. Mr. Paul Whittle can be contacted on his blog, The 1888 Letter, and on Twitter, he's at 1888 Letter. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify and now on Google, Apple, and Stitcher, all under Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. Please leave a review, rate, and subscribe if you like the podcast. Mr. Stewart's contact info on Twitter and his website, the Scotland Epistles.com. This information is listed on the blog and the podcast listings. So once again, Davey, thank you, and hope to continue these discussions into the next season.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, we'll join you next time for the start of the Andy Roxburgh era.
Yeah.
Thank you.